Hey everyone, Dr. Adriana Popescu with you today, which is World PTSD Awareness Day. It's actually been PTSD Awareness Month, and then we have a special day dedicated to it as well. And today is that day. So I figured, as a psychologist who specializes in treating trauma, that it would be a good idea to go live and talk a little bit about what I've learned about unresolved trauma, what I've learned about PTSD, post traumatic stress disorder, and hopefully will help dispel some myths that I think a lot of people have about these issues. So, let me start with kind of the first myth, which is what exactly is trauma. I think some people have a really specific idea that something traumatic has to be a life threatening, really serious major event like a war or a major assault of some kind where bodily harm, or your life is at stake, or maybe like a natural disaster, fires, hurricanes, tornadoes, all the things. And yes, while those things may be, in fact, traumatic experiences, whether or not you personally will experience it as a trauma really depends, right? We could have 10 people all go through the same event, let's say like a natural disaster, and some of them are going to, pick up and move on and be able to function and live their lives. Other people might become so debilitated that they can't get out of bed, that they are struggling with things like nightmares or flashbacks or intrusive memories. They might find it difficult to feel safe or to be able to, be around things that remind them of that experience. And that, if someone is having those kinds of symptoms, we might consider that they have something called post-traumatic stress disorder, which means that they're continuing to experience the effects of trauma long after the event itself has ended. Now, whether or not you're going to be the person who's able to pick up and move on or get stuck in it really depends on your level of resilience. And there's a lot of factors that go into resilience, including, and really resilience is your ability to bounce back from adverse experiences. And that's going to be shaped very much by your history. What is the history you've had of adverse experiences or traumatic experiences in the past? If you have had a history of trauma, you're more likely to be impacted by a new experience. You're more likely to have the effect of you of being a trauma versus someone else who might have more strength and be able to overcome that more readily. It's going to be dependent on what kind of support system you have. It's going to be dependent on your physical, mental, emotional, spiritual health and well-being in general. What's your baseline? So there's a lot of factors that go into it, and it isn't just about the event itself. Just because you went through a war doesn't mean you're going to come out traumatized or with PTSD. You might not. Again, it depends on your level of resilience. Another myth that I often see is people think that in order to be affected by trauma, you had to have had the event happen to you. And that's also not true. There's a thing called vicarious traumatization. And you can, in fact, qualify to get a diagnosis of PTSD if you have witnessed something horrible happening to someone else, particularly if it's someone you care about, maybe someone you know personally. But people can be affected by community violence. They can be affected by many types of events that they didn't personally experience as a life-threatening event, but that nonetheless affected them in the same way. And why is that? Well, again, it's because of a person's resilience. And also a lot of it is about the brain chemistry, right? Because when you go through one of these traumatic experiences, you will have an activation of your fight, flight, freeze response. Okay. And that can happen whether it's happening to you directly or not. So vicarious traumatization can be just as powerful as experiencing something yourself. And then back on this idea of what is trauma, I just want to add another piece. Sometimes you might have heard the terminology big T trauma or little t trauma, which I really have moved away from liking that language because I think it still minimizes the little t trauma, But often people are thinking of big T trauma again as those assaults, maybe a rape, or being beaten up, or natural disasters, wars, major accidents, things like that. But there are also these other adverse experiences we can have that people can experience with the same level of intensity and emotional distress, that we might not label big T trauma. This might be things like the loss, like having the loss of a significant relationship, the loss of a job, even of a pet. It could be being bullied or being harassed. It could be financial ruin of some sort, like losing all your money in the stock market, or losing your home to foreclosure, or something along those lines. It could be there's religious and spiritual trauma, besides the more obvious things like people in positions of power abusing children or whatever. But you might have grown up in a very strict or rigid belief system that was really invalidating of you in some way. Like maybe you have maybe you identify as LGBTQ, and your religion or dogma of your group, that your belief system doesn't support that, says that people who are like that are sinners in some kind of way. That can be experienced as a trauma. But rather than calling it big T or little t trauma, I prefer now to use the terms overt and covert. Overt are the more obvious ones. Covert might be less obvious, but nonetheless still is impactful. Okay. So that's another couple myths there with what is trauma. Another one is that there has to be an identifiable event, like this one single thing or a series of things. And that's not necessarily true either. Yes, you can have PTSD from a single event, like your house burned down in a fire, or it can be, and that might be what's known as like a single event or acute PTSD. And you can have chronic or recurring episodes of PTSD, complex PTSD, it's sometimes called. And that might be growing up in a home, for example, where there's an alcoholic person who gets violent sometimes, or somebody who's suffering with a mental health disorder. It might be the repetitive being subjected to living in unsafe conditions. You're living in a unsafe neighborhood where there's a lot of violence happening, things like that. It doesn't always have to be a single event. And often when I, meet with new clients, sometimes they'll say, well, there's nothing really traumatic in my background, I wasn't raped, I wasn't beat up, this, that, or the other. But then when you dig a little deeper, you find that there were a series of maybe those more covert traumas, or even neglect. Being neglected in childhood can be quite profoundly traumatizing, where you're felt, you get the feeling that you don't matter and nobody's caring about you. So that's another way that this stuff can show up, and it can still be experienced in this very disruptive kind of way. The next myth I want to dispel is that I think there's this common notion out there that people have that, so some bad things happen to you, get over it, move on, it's in the past. I wish it were that simple. I wish we could say that time heals trauma, but it doesn't. Because the reality is trauma is not just psychological, it's physiological. The Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, Harvard psychiatrist, wrote this wonderful book called The Body Keeps the Score. And he really talks about how trauma gets locked into the viscera of our body, our muscles, our bones, our tissues. I used to be a massage therapist, and I would, work on people's bodies, and I would touch somewhere and they would burst into tears. And I was like, oh, wow, like this is that trauma that gets locked into the body. And, you don't get a chance to release it. Some of you have heard me say this before, but if you ever watch a nature show and you see, let's say an animal is being chased by another animal. Well, when that animal, if it's able to successfully outrun the predator and get to safety, the first thing it does, it shakes out all that fight, flight, freeze energy that when it gets locked into your body, in humans, and we don't get a chance to like release it, it gets stuck in there, right? And this is when, people are having, gosh, some of the folks I work with who have PTSD have very visceral somatic memories of their abuse. Like if they were hit in a certain part of their body, they can still feel sensations in there. Often people who've had sexual abuse might have pain or discomfort in their genital area. I mean, there's any number of ways that this can show up. But it also tends to include in the brain an overactive amygdala. The amygdala is the part of your brain that is the part of your brain that decides whether or not you're in danger, right? Your senses are always picking up cues in the environment, and it gets, directed to the thalamus, and the thalamus routes it to the amygdala, and the amygdala decides if we're in a life-threatening situation. If it thinks we are, it activates either fight or flight, or if death is potentially imminent, the freeze response as a last-ditch attempt to save one's life, hoping that if you play dead, the predator might leave you alone. So you have fight or flight, which is where everything speeds up, your heart rate and everything. Your pupils dilate, the blood flow gets rerouted to your extremities so that you can either fight the danger or run away from it. Freeze would be the total shutdown. So what happens for folks who've had one or multiple of these experiences where the body, actually the brain, felt like we were in a life-threatening situation, then it tends to overreact. Then it tends to keep firing that mechanism over and over again, even if you're not actually in a life-threatening situation. So you're having basically a potential full-blown panic attack because you're running late, or because your boss yelled at you, or whatever. It could be some common everyday occurrence, but you experience it much more intensely than someone else might because you have this history of experiencing that kind of thing as traumatic. And then so your body is stuck. It gets stuck in fight or flight or freeze, or alternates between both. That'll take its toll on your body. People who've had adverse childhood experiences, they've done, tons of research on this, sometimes have a lifespan, depending on how much they've experienced, can have a lifespan that's 20 years shorter than someone who has not experienced a high number of adverse childhood experiences, because again, that stress response is getting activated over and over again. So that's not something that you can just wish away. It's not something that even conventional talk therapy alone can resolve. Because when you tell your trauma story, you just re-traumatize yourself. You activate that fight, flight, freeze response, and then you're stuck in it. You never get a chance to like release it out, which is why nowadays really best practices are showing that to do trauma work with someone, you actually have to do processing. You have to go back to that experience in a safe way, and you have to let the person complete, because it's almost like what I say often is it's almost like someone hit the pause button in the middle of the trauma and then keeps hitting play, and you keep replaying the same scene over and over again. You never get a chance to play the scene all the way through until you get to the point of, oh, well, actually I'm safe and I survived and I'm okay. Now I'm okay. When you're stuck on pause, you don't feel okay because you feel like the event is still happening over and over again. You keep feeling like it's happening right here, right now, right? That's what a flashback is. You're re-experiencing it as if it's happening right now. So the body needs support in releasing that and getting out of that fight, flight, freeze response. We have to basically extinguish trauma responses, and we do that with holistic therapies that include the body. So that might be something like EMDR or brain spotting, could be energy psychology. That's shown a lot of success, especially tapping on acupuncture points, somatic experiencing, sensory motor therapy, Hakomi. I mean, there's so many different trauma release exercises, which allows your body, gives it a chance to shake that energy out. So there's a lot of potential therapies that are super helpful. We specialize in them at Firebird Healing, my trauma treatment program. All our therapists are trained in these modalities, and we've had great success in helping people to heal from trauma. So, which is my last myth I'd like to dispel, this idea that once you've experienced a trauma or you have something like PTSD, it's uncurable. You're going to be stuck with this for the rest of your life. That is simply not true. Tons of research has come out that says especially when you're using these more mind-body based modalities, some people are coming out of a PTSD diagnosis in anywhere from 1 to 10 sessions of this kind of therapy. And they no longer meet the criteria for PTSD after receiving those sessions. So we know people can heal. We have the technology to help people heal. We now have the science and that explains to us how all this works, and we can use technology to scan people's brains and check their brain waves and do all these things to show that these modalities do make an effect before and after, changes the way the brain functions. For example, meditation, right? Tapping, breathing, this paced breathing that we do, 4 square, 4-7-8, all of those things basically send a deactivating signal to the amygdala and gets that nervous system calm, right? And they've looked at people's brain waves before and after and doing these different practices, and they can see the amygdala is more quiet, right? There's less activity there. Interestingly enough, you tend to see a lot of overlap between unresolved trauma and substance use or addiction of various kinds. Why? Because similar parts of the brain are being activated when people are heavily addicted to or using a lot of drugs and alcohol or other addictive behaviors to cope with that discomfort of the trauma. Oftentimes, they've got that overactive amygdala happening as well. So really working with the body, working with the brain, using not only the trauma processing, but these other supportive modalities, yoga, meditation, mindfulness practices, self-care, time in nature, pets, being with your pets, being with supportive loved ones. All of these things help to co-regulate the nervous system to get more calm and to feel safe again. Because the number one thing that people struggle with trauma is feeling unsafe. So we need to create safe spaces in order for people to heal. So I hope that this talk has been useful to you. Please feel free to comment in the comments box, or if you have any questions, I will definitely be checking those out and respond, even if you're watching this later. And if you feel like you have your own unresolved trauma that you would like to work on, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at Firebird Healing. You can get a free consultation with me, and we can see if working together might be a good fit. So firebird-healing.com, or you can DM me here. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and may you be happy and at peace with whatever you're dealing with. Please know that there is hope for healing. So thank you, everyone.